Welcome to the Hollywood Heretic, the entertainment industry podcast where we break down what's broken and how to fix it. I'm Wade Major, and today I'm unbelievably honored to welcome three people who have seen this business through countless ups and downs and know the ins and outs better than almost anyone else out there. All former executives with the National Association of Theater Owners, the other NATO, now partnered in the consulting firm, the Fithian Group. First, the company's namesake, who spent over 23 years as president and CEO of NATO, Mr. John Fithian. John, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us, Wade.
Second, president of the Cinema Foundation and former executive vice president and general counsel for NATO, Ms. Jackie Brenneman. Thank you for being here, Jackie.
Thank you.
And finally, far from least, former Vice President and Chief Communications Officer, Director of Media and Research for NATO, Mr. Patrick Corcoran. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
And I should note in full disclosure, you bet. And I should note in full disclosure that I spent quite a few years as senior film critic at Box Office Magazine when it was the official publication of NATO. And those were some very, very good years. So let's get into it. And please, I would invite all three of you to make this as conversational as possible. John, please start us off by telling us about the Fithian Group and how it all came together last year that you guys pivoted after so many years with NATO to creating this fascinating new enterprise.
Well, Wade, first, thanks for having us on. We did value our partnership with Box Office back in the day. In fact, I think NATO is still partnered with Box Office. So some things suggest that good partnerships last for a long time. And honestly, that's what Jackie and Patrick and I hope to do now, is create a great partnership that will last for a long time. Why did we do this? Well, we each, love cinema owners. We're each very passionate about the movie-going experience. That's why we worked at NATO for all those years. And learned a lot about the people that operate motion picture theaters. We learned a lot about the people that produce movies, the people that distribute movies, and kind of fell in love with the whole ecosystem. So when I retired from NATO and all three of us left NATO, we decided to set up a consulting firm whose basic purpose is this: to use data, technology, innovation in ways that can improve the production, distribution, and exhibition of movies and other content. We've got projects going in each of those three realms. The industry has just gone through two very challenging periods in both COVID, the pandemic, and then the strikes. But we believe that the industry is poised to take advantage of innovations like those we are trying to bring to market to really see a resurgence in movie going and enjoyment of the cinema environment for lots of different types of content. So that's what we're trying to do.
I mean, it's certainly obviously something that I think is needed, because what struck a lot of us who are all on that side of wanting to see the theatrical experience succeed and knowing that it has to succeed. The LA Times ran a story right after that dismal Memorial Day opening for Furiosa saying the audience has moved on. And then a week later, Bad Boys overperformed, and then Inside Out, doubled its projections. And we can get into the mystical science of forecasting later, but it sort of seems like they jumped the gun on that. And shouldn't they have known after Top Gun Maverick and Barbie and Oppenheimer that it's really about the films? It's not about anything else. Hollywood has to make the films that people want to see. Isn't that ultimately what it comes down to?
I think it does, to a degree. I think one of the things that happens in the way our industry is covered, and that was sort of my end of the job at NATO, is sort of managing how the industry is perceived. And it is a cycle of panic and elation that runs based on how movies are going weekend by weekend. And if you have sort of a period where there are some structural issues, where there is a big external force that has been keeping movies from movie theaters, people begin to think about doom and gloom. So everything that fits that scenario becomes more confirmation of doom and gloom. And anything that doesn't fit that is like, oh, that was a good movie, and people came to see it. It doesn't become sustained. But one of the things that we've seen over so many years is that even though, yes, theater owners can panic about a lot of things, they are some of the most positive people in the world because they believe in the power of movies. They believe that audiences want them. And we believe that too. What we have seen, and it's not just from the pandemic, it's not just from the strikes, but going back about 25 years, is there aren't enough movies. It's a structural issue that you need a certain number of wide release movies to sustain movie going. And that has benefits all up and down the ecosystem, right? It's not just those movies, but independent movies, the awareness of movie going, and people remembering that they like movies, and there has to be something there for them to see. If there aren't enough movies, you are not going to have enough box office.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here for a second too, and say kind of that the question itself seems to also point to a bigger trend that Patrick's kind of alluding to, which is our industry used to run on a steady slate of movies, right? And some movies worked, some movies didn't work, but movie going worked because people knew that they could go to the movies and see movies any Friday night, any Tuesday afternoon, whenever, wherever there was a movie for them. And so it didn't matter how one particular movie performed or not. And in recent years, the entire narrative around the industry has become one of eventizing, about the movie theaters being this place where each individual movie has to become an event. It has to be something really special and worth getting out of the house for. And that's a lot of pressure to put on movies. And it's a lot of pressure to put on movie going. And that works if you're talking about a major tentpole. And of course, those ones that don't work, that's a big problem for those titles. But putting the pressure of an event on each movie is not what our industry was based on. Our industry is based on people getting together with their friends and family and processing emotions together as a community, laughing, crying, whatever it is, coalescing around something. It is a thing to do. It is the most affordable out of home entertainment option. And we've forgotten that. We've lost sight of it. And we hinge the success and failure of an entire business model on individual movies. And that kind of narrative and that kind of pressure is completely unsustainable. And it's also changing the way audiences engage with this activity. So it's an overall narrative that I believe is harming the industry, and it's not your narrative, it is the narrative.
So let's talk about that for a second, about how to unwind that narrative. And I'm thinking specifically lately, everyone was saying that Kevin Costner's Horizon was such a disappointment, opening with 11 million, and Costner sort of shrugged at that and said, I'm okay with that. The sequel's coming out. The second part is coming out in August. And he thinks that the opening weekend, that everything rides in the opening weekend, is just a paradigm that he doesn't need to subscribe to. And, historically, I mean, you look back, and the examples I like to cite, mostly from the 80s, but E.T. took 12 solid months of release to get to 399 million domestically, which was a record at the time. And Howard's End, early 90s, little independent film, sat around for over a year, barely making any money until it got a boatload of Academy Award nominations. And then it made something like 80% of its final gross in those last few weeks after it had already been around for 10, 11 months. And then you look at something like when Batman opened, to your point, Patrick, which I think is an excellent one, that you need inventory. Everyone thought, oh, nothing else is going to make money when Tim Burton's Batman opened. But in point of fact, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids opened that same weekend to also record numbers. And so movie-going begets movie-going. And the idea that you have to somehow make all your money in the first 2 or 3 weeks so that the next film in the queue can come and get into theaters, I think audiences would say, I'll stick around for the next few months and I'll take my time to see these movies. And they don't have to come and go within 4 to 5 weeks and line up as such. As long as there is a selection of movies, a volume of movies that are out there in the theaters, I want to go. Is that a correct read?
I think it is. And I also think some of the pressure on the opening weekend or the first couple of weeks, and then consequently on release windows, going to the next market, going to the ancillary windows, is very much driven not by the needs of movies, not by the needs of audiences or desires of audiences. It's driven by Wall Street and the need to have quarterly results. You've got to book all that stuff in that quarter, get it done, get it out, move it along. And they're not thinking about the long-term health of their businesses, not just the theater business, but their own businesses. And you look at even more recent examples of something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which played for months and months and months and did fantastic business, right? Consistent, steady business. Was not the biggest movie when it opened, but it was solid. And it just kept building on that and played at almost the same level for weeks on end. And that's possible for a lot of different movies. And, some of it comes from the amount of money that's being spent to make movies and to market those movies. So there's this huge overhang of, oh, how did it do on its opening weekend? Because it needs to make that money back. Well, that's not a pressure we see on movies that are going straight to streaming, which is, part of the problem in our industry, right? Those don't have the same metrics. It's like, oh, how many views did it have? I don't know, but did it make money? We don't know. But we have every week this metric of box office saying, oh, it's a success or a failure. And there's a much longer term view you can take on any movie. Not every movie has to be a wide release. We certainly need wide releases. We certainly need those events. Not everyone has to be an event. We have to have a mix of movies. And that's one of the biggest issues I think that we have, is not just there aren't enough movies, but the mix of movies is off. It can't just be tent poles. It can't just be action adventure. It can't just be sci-fi or comic books or whatever. We need dramas. We need comedies.
John, would you please speak to that? Fixing the ecosystem, and I love what Patrick said about the quarterly earnings pressure, because it's something that I hammer on this Substack constantly, which is that they're not responding to artists and audiences. The job of the studios is technically to connect artists and audiences, but instead they've gotten to this place where they've saddled themselves with so much debt, much of it because of streaming, that they are now more responsive to analysts than they are to audiences. So how do we dig our way out of that?
Well, there are a couple ways that we want to help dig the industry out of that problem. Let's just look at the film supply issue that Patrick and Jackie accurately described. There are too few movies being released. There is too little diversity in the movies being released. And by diversity, I mean genre, budget, you name it. And there's not sophisticated marketing tools that can target the right kinds of audiences to get those movies to play theatrically. And so one of our projects is to try to tackle all of that, and to use data and to use AI and to use loyalty information, to use creative information about a movie that's being distributed, and put all that data into an online marketplace and connect directly people who are producers or directors of movies or small independent distributors of movies with theaters that have the demographics of the audiences that are likely to do well with that movie. Call it a direct distribution system, call it a theatrical marketplace. We're not sure yet what to call it. But the idea is to make it easier, more cost effective, more data driven, with an overlay of marketing sophistication on top of all of that, to get more movies released into theaters, or to get movies that are currently only released in a couple of theaters to be released more broadly with the right kind of marketing support. The idea that blockbusters alone can sustain the movie-going experience is a fallacy, and we are working to try to bring more theatrical releases into theaters with more sophisticated marketing campaigns. Jackie, looks like you want to go.
You look like you had a thought for that. Go ahead.
I always have a thought. And I just, box office alone it's a piece of information, right? It just is. $11 million. What does that mean? What is the context? And we don't know the full story, right? And one of the things that I find really interesting is when a studio talks about the fact that a movie does X% of its business within the first 3 weeks. They usually say that, as kind of Patrick was mentioning, as a way to put pressure on the release window. And the thing that's interesting about that is it's true that a movie will do the bulk, most movies will do the bulk of their business near the beginning of the run. But the thing that's really, really important is that when you look at all the data, and we have over, decades, that the longer the movie plays in the theaters, the bigger that number is. So yes, if it does 65% in the first 4 weeks, well, 65% of what? Right? That number, you can make it a smaller number or a bigger number depending on how long you let that movie play in the theaters and find its audience. And so a lot of this industry seems to be these self-fulfilling like there's just it self-fulfilling. I can speak. And if we have a little bit more imagination and take a little bit more risk, then we can actually find new points of information. So like John was saying, our system envisions a lot more flexibility. It envisions new metrics for success. Maybe your movie can play a couple of show times a week, but for a longer period of time and actually have fuller houses. Maybe ours are about attendance numbers on certain titles and box office for other titles and. We don't want it to just be one metric, because we think that if you're just looking at one metric to determine the success of an entire industry, you're not really looking at the full picture. And so that's really important to us. And Patrick mentioned Everything Everywhere All at Once. Well, that one, again, it played for a very long time and it didn't go straight to streaming. And so it actually made the bulk of its money after its initial 6 weeks of run. So anything can happen, but anything won't happen unless we try to make new decisions.
So that reminds me of when back in 1997, everyone was saying that, oh, Titanic, it's $300 million movie, and it opened at number 2. It's over. It was second to the James Bond film in opening weekend, and then second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. It just began kind of slow building. Everyone forgets that Titanic really was a build. And then it just stuck around like E.T. did back in the early 80s and 82. It just didn't go away. And audiences got wind of it. There was the word of mouth factor, which I think we've kind of lost sight of. It's all about the pre-release buzz now and how many tickets have been pre-sold. And they're not thinking about, well, if people love it in that opening weekend and they tell their friends to see it and then they tell their friends to see it, we're now talking about something that has to be a phenomenon of perhaps even months as opposed to just weeks. So let me talk for a second now about that issue, the forecasting issue, which has become, I think, kind of a problem. And Inside Out 2, for me, revealed just the magnitude of that problem. They were forecasting an $80 million opening, and it had 155. It doubled. So they missed half the audience in their forecasting. Now, forecasting pegged Horizon at 10 to 12, and it came in at 11. So it was right on there. But do we put too much into forecasting, and is forecasting hurting the process? And if it is, how do we pivot the business away from kind of shooting itself in the foot with forecasting?
I think it allows people to.
I'll just say.
It allows people to sort of prejudge and pre-write their stories and have a narrative around a particular title that is damaging, that doesn't allow the movie to reach its natural audience. And again, it's part of the disconnect between what a movie cost, and therefore here's the forecast, oh, it's a failure, it's going to not work. And what is a failure for a producer or a studio is not necessarily a failure for a theater. Right? You go back to, Steven Spielberg saying, well, we're too much on these blockbusters and comic book movies. And, we're going to have a thing where 4 of them are going to fail and the industry is going to change and it's going to destroy everything. Well, within weeks, we had 4 movies that underperformed, that were big, giant blockbusters. And everybody was like, Spielberg was right. And he was right, except movie theaters did great business with all 4 of those movies.
Hey, Patrick, we can't hear you.
Yeah, Patrick, you're freezing left and right, Patrick. Your system is just, I don't know if it's your Wi-Fi connection or what it is, but we're now missing about every other word. So Jackie, while Patrick tries to fix his Wi-Fi, you get to jump in. I don't know
Sure.
why I said that.
So forecasting is broken across the board, right? I think everyone's trying to figure out how to poll audiences. And it seems to be pretty reliable when you're looking at a certain type of movie that attracts a certain type of audience that does a lot of pre-sales, right? And so that's, movies that attract young fanboys in the first weekend. So if it's a boy movie and it's going to have a lot of boys who want to come to it in the first weekend, you can kind of get a general sense because they buy their tickets in advance. But Inside Out 2, family movie, and so you're going to have a lot of female audiences. They're a lot less likely to buy as in advance in the same way. Kids are unpredictable. You're just going to kind of feel it out and go on a Saturday. So we haven't figured out yet how to really harness the full breadth of moviegoers. It's the same thing on kind of all polls that are happening across all industries. There was a way you could figure audiences out, one way to reach them, one way to ask them questions that was pretty reliable. That's all been broken, and no industry is yet to kind of figure out how to meet all audiences where they are. So there are kind of a lot of shortcuts, and they are really unreliable. And I will say on Inside Out 2, I had a lot of discussions with a lot of people in the industry before that movie came out. And everyone was saying they were worried about it. They were worried about it because they kept reading about, other people being worried, and they knew that Pixar movies had underperformed, and all I have are my own anecdotal experiences. But I was like, I have young children and they know that's a movie theater movie. And their friends are talking about it. I think this one is like, it's sticking. I think that kids want to go see it. And if kids want to go see it, then I think that that's a big difference. My kids weren't aware of other Pixar movies. So it's really, we all live in our own little bubbles and we test around our own bubbles. And it's a great way to guess how much popcorn to order. It is not a great way to make big decisions in our business.
And I'll
John,
jump
you
in
had
there
a
if
thought
I
on that
may,
too.
Wade. Yeah, and say not just forecasting. Almost every metric system Hollywood uses is wrong and focused on the wrong things. Okay. And almost every Hollywood distribution policy is wrong and focused on the wrong things. And I know that sounds really disrespectful and radical, but let me go through some of them. Okay. Forecasting is ridiculous. Tracking is ridiculous. Trying to predict what's going to happen is ridiculous. But more ridiculous than that is deciding by Saturday morning if the movie is a hit or a failure, and deciding for small pictures what the per screen average is, and using the per screen average as a judgment of success when all that does is drive down the number of movie theaters to get access to that title, because somehow Hollywood's decided per screen average for independent film is the indicia of success. In terms of distribution policies, why do we have to play movies for a 3-week guarantee in a small town with one screen where everybody's seen the movie in 2 weeks or 1 week? Why does the same movie have to play on the same screen at every screen time 7 days a week? Why wouldn't it be better to play a family title at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and to play a horror film at 10 o'clock at night and something in the middle, and mix up programming and mix up everything about the business to satisfy what our customers and moviegoers want? Hollywood, in its metrics of success, in its distribution policies, in the way it interprets everything about the business mathematically, is based on 100-year-old relics that need to be discarded into the trash bin, and a whole new world of how to program, how to distribute, how to market, how to measure, is what the industry needs. And we hope to do quite a bit of that in the various projects we're setting up. But it is time to shake up Hollywood, because what people have shown is if the movies are good and they learn about the movies, they're going to come and watch them. Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, doesn't matter. People are coming out to watch good movies that they've heard about in theaters. And there just aren't enough good movies. They're being programmed with old-fashioned policies. They're being prejudged by bad advanced metrics, and they're not being marketed correctly. So we have a lot to do, but we are very optimistic in trying to tackle all of these things and to shake up the industry a little bit to get it back to where it should be and beyond.
Though that is, I think, music to a lot of our ears. And again, when I have these conversations, people point out, oh, the pandemic, it sent everybody at home. But yes, we dropped from about $10 billion box office a year to $2 billion in 2020. But 2021 was double that, back to $4 billion. And then 2022 got back up to almost $8 billion. 2023, we had the strikes. That took a bite out of inventory and everything else. But the trend line was, the further we get back, the more rapidly people start coming back. And last summer was a wake up for me when you saw The Sound of Freedom, released by this little distributor, Angel Studios, it closed in on 200 million domestically. It made more than The Flash. It made more than Indiana Jones, and it made more than the other Pixar film, the title of which is escaping me. What was the last one last summer? See, I can't even remember. It was Oscar nominated, and it made more than almost any of the other tentpoles. Even Mission Impossible. It made more than Mission Impossible. So, and then you had Taylor Swift. Her concert film came out, didn't go through the studios, went straight to AMC. They cut a deal themselves. That also came in close to 200 million domestically and then Godzilla -1, Toho, who doesn't even have a distribution office in the United States. They grabbed something like 1,500 screens at the end of the year. And with a Japanese language Godzilla film made for only a few $1 million, they made all their money back in the US alone. Everything in Japan and elsewhere was gravy. I look at these examples, and I look at things like what Costner is doing with Horizon, that you can get a discount on part one if you buy both part one and part two in advance, or what Angel did with Sound of Freedom, that the pay it forward, that they gave you a QR code at the end of the movie, and you could buy a friend a ticket right then and there in the moment, in the heat of having just seen the film. I look at those kinds of innovative strategies. They're not coming from the studios. They're coming from outside. So is that where this has to come from, or can we push the studios beyond their quarterly earnings? What do you see in the tea leaves?
It can only come from outside the studios. Sorry, Patrick, your lag. I didn't know you were talking.
Crazy. It's crazy.
Go ahead.
We don't have enough studios to make bold moves, right? They are all in competition with each other and all operating with the exact same business model as one another. So take innovation in pricing, right? We hear a lot of studio thoughts on pricing, both directions. But there's not a studio that's really able to take variable pricing and really make a test of it, right? Because how do they explain to their filmmakers that your movie might be cheaper one day versus another title, right? It seems like it's a indicator of quality rather than an indicator of demand on certain times and in certain theaters and etc. So there is just zero innovation. Where do we see innovation? Well, when MoviePass first came out, they started putting pressure on exhibition and studios for subscription models. For a long time, exhibitors that were kind of thinking about subscription models were told absolutely not by the studios, right? There was not even the possibility to have a real conversation about that. But when a third party entered the system and it started actually impacting movie going, which it absolutely did, then all of a sudden it forced a conversation, right? And so that's really important. And that's absolutely, when we're talking about the system that we're building and the flexibility and innovation that we hope to implement into this system, we will be releasing lots and lots of reports that will hopefully drive some more of this innovation. When we talk about like the indie titles, especially the ones that need more time, need more word of mouth, and have much less awareness generally, those are also the movies that are vastly over-indexing on things like a MoviePass, even the new iteration of MoviePass, and all of the loyalty programs. I talk to indie distributors, indie filmmakers, and they will tell you that their bread and butter are these discount programs. People are much more likely to go see those movies if they feel like they're getting a different kind of value for them. They understand going to see them in a theater is valuable, but they also don't, there's been so much price pressure up on PLFs and all of that, that it becomes the narrative about going to the movie. So people need a different thing when they're going to a smaller title. It doesn't mean they value them less. It means that there's a different model. And the same thing when we were doing National Cinema Days, we saw some of these titles drastically over-indexed. And we asked audiences questions and we said, why did you pick the movie you picked? And for the top 2 reasons people picked the movies that they picked, especially on those smaller titles, were number 1, oh, I was just going to wait to see it on streaming. Or number 2, it had bad reviews, so I wasn't going to go. But all of a sudden, when we lower the price to last year, it was $4. Still, you're going with your friends. That's still more expensive than seeing it at home. They didn't care as much, and they were much more willing to take chances. But even though we have this data, nothing is changing. Nothing will change unless a third party comes in and is willing to change. So that's what we're trying to do.
And
Now,
the
I'm
basis
glad
of
you brought
that,
up MoviePass, and a lot of this.
that's all right.
Yeah,
What I was
sorry.
gonna
Go ahead,
say,
Patrick. Go ahead.
yeah, and hopefully I'm not lagging and the technology is not killing me today. But one of the keys is competition. I think that what you need innovation for that competition, and we have 5 major suppliers supplying 80 to 90% of our box office, and we need more. And that's where the independents come in. That's where, if you look at Europe and elsewhere, where you have really strong national film industries, they have a higher percentage of box office than the major studios do, and that's something we need here in the domestic market as well.
Interesting. And I was reading that in the trades. They were saying that Europe and elsewhere, post-pandemic theatrical is back. It's only in the U.S. and North America where it's still not quite back on. John, it looks like you have a thought.
Well, it's not quite right to say all of Europe's back and all of North America's not. It's very localized, right? If as Patrick said, if a national or local film industry is producing good movies that people want to see, combined with Hollywood titles, those territories are doing much better, right? Germany's doing quite well because of that. Some of the Asian countries are doing quite well because of local product. And Patrick's point is that in the U.S., we really don't have local product. We used to. We used to have a lot of movies about baseball and American topics and American history, and we don't have that much of that anymore because the movies made by the majors are all supposed to be global blockbusters that appeal to everyone in the world. And the missing middle that Patrick describes means that we don't have a local film industry in the United States. We have a global film industry. And yet many of these other territories around the world have a local film industry and they play the global film product. So when you get something like a strike in the US in particular, that delays production of a whole lot of films, and there is no supplement for that, it hurts the US and Canada market much more than it would hurt a European market who can substitute their own independent film.
Interesting. Okay, so let me come back at that then through what Jackie had brought up, the MoviePass phenomenon, which at the time, because all we saw was MoviePass becoming a phenomenon and then going bankrupt. So people drew a lot of sort of knee-jerk conclusions from that. And I drew the conclusion that it succeeded too well, that the business model only proved that too many people wanted to go to the movies. They assumed that a certain number of people would go and that they'd be able to kind of carve out a little bit of off the top from the people who didn't use it as much. But it turned out tons of people wanted to use it and everybody used it as much as possible and they simply couldn't keep up. There's a documentary on Max right now, MoviePass, Movie Crash, made by Mark Wahlberg's company, which I would recommend everybody see. It's extraordinary. And it gets into all of the business mistakes, but it does underline the fact that, in fact, that takeaway was correct, that it proved that there was a market that was huge and untapped and driven primarily by cost considerations, cost-benefit analysis. And people may not even realize that MoviePass is back. One of the original founders bought it out of bankruptcy and has successfully had a profitable year now. So the model works, and it proves the point that you were all making. But again, we need non-studio companies to enter the fray. It sounds like what we're saying. We need others to come in and give this fresh blood. So who's going to give us that fresh blood? Is it A24? Is it Neon? Is it others? How do you I mean, Miramax used to sort of be the 800-pound gorilla in the room with all of that, and they were the center of gravity for what everyone saw as the alternative to the studios. We don't really have that anymore. Is it Lionsgate? Where do you guys see this coming from?
It's not any particular studio.
I
It's there we are again with our lags. I'm sorry. It's structural.
Go ahead, Patrick.
It's that there are gatekeepers keeping those movies out. That the barrier to entry to getting movies into theaters is too high. It's too encumbered by old practices, people using spreadsheets and using their phones and trying to book movies. And it's part of what we're trying to do with our system, which is to streamline that, make it less expensive, make it easier for filmmakers and film rights holders and distributors to reach theaters and to be innovative in their booking and to use marketing in a smart way to reach audiences that just aren't being reached right now. It is very much an old industry that has not learned yet how to use technology to bridge the gaps and make things more efficient between distribution and exhibition. And that's what we seek to do.
Yeah, and I want to rethink even just the premise behind the question, which is the only way to make a movie is to have a studio attached. A lot of the smaller studios and even the big studios aren't necessarily making movies. They're a lot of the times, like, they were buying movies that were already financed, already made. So maybe the new question is, what is the role of what are the different roles that you need now to get a movie made, put into theaters, then put into the home, make an impact culturally? What are the different jobs that we need in this day and age to make that happen, right? And one of our thoughts is, do you need a traditional distributor to do all the traditional distributor tasks for all movies? If there is a way to build a footprint and to make those deals effectively and efficiently, and allow a distributor to focus much more on marketing, much more on connecting with audiences and finding audiences, identifying audiences, marrying that with the plan, making a few phone calls here and there to make sure everyone that you asked to book the movie is booking the movie. But really, if a filmmaker can go out and use a system, use technology and data to get the right booking plan, use their own, use that information also to raise money to get marketing. If there's a way to kind of divorce some of these roles and think about them in new ways, what else can we do, right? There are movies sitting out there right now that are already made that audiences will like, that because you need a distributor now to get a movie into a theater are simply not going to find their audience. And that seems to me to be an enormous missed opportunity, because those distributors, there's not enough of them to take those movies. There's not enough manpower. And I say manpower pretty literally in this business right now, but there just isn't. And so it is critical, if there are movies and there are audiences, and we need to put those two things together, there's got to be a better way. And we think there is one, right? There's a narrative about, oh, we're just meeting audiences where they are. Well, that's obviously untrue. And we want to meet audiences where they want to be. And where audiences want to be is in a theater with their friends. And that, again, like you said, MoviePass proved it. We just need to make it so that they can be where they want to be, with who they want to be, when they want to be there. And we think we can do that.
I think that's a great point. I mean, the scenes that resonated with me in the Movie Crash documentary were all of these people who just could not believe their good fortune at this deal, and they say, "Oh, I was seeing 2 and 3 movies a day." And you think, do you have a job? No, they have a job. And then when the job was over, they went and they saw a movie. They would prefer to be in a theater to staying at home alone on the couch and watching streaming. The social element of that, I think, is missed by so many people. Let's talk about another economic part of the business, which streaming missed. And I've often pointed out that Netflix, being a tech company more than an entertainment company, subscribes to a business model that comes from Silicon Valley, which is scalability. It's what drives video games. It's what drives software, is that you're looking for a scalable business model. Whereas Entertainment is based on a scarcity model. There are only 52 weekends in a year, and there are only so many theaters, and people only have so much time. And when something becomes an elite experience and it is rare and accessible only for a period of time and only in certain theaters, the value goes up. And it is often pointed out, and I've spoken to finance people from the studios who they're apoplectic over the fact that the tech companies like Netflix and Amazon, they sort of miss the fact that theatrical distribution indexes a film's value for all other exploitation. So whatever it makes in theaters in North America, that benchmarks what its value is going to be for VOD, for streaming, for marketing, for merchandising, for everything else. So it behooves them to make sure that films do well first and foremost in theaters. How do we convince the people who haven't processed that and who've lost billions on streaming to get back to what works and what we've seen work for the better part of the last century? John, could you weigh in on that?
Yeah, so when we all three were still at the National Association of Theater Owners, we held countless conversations with Netflix, with Amazon, with Apple, anybody else looking at this intersection of content, movies, television shows. Do they go to theaters? Do they not? Do they just go straight to streaming? Is there a laddered or windowed or effect of how movies and television shows are released? And all the data points that you just made, we made, right? And Jackie at the Cinema Foundation created a lot of this data that was really great about the fact that a movie released into a movie theater first with some kind of robust period of exclusivity then does much better when it hits a streaming service. It's a known quantity. It's a talked about brand. All of that data is very, very clear. So that's why Amazon and Apple then began to experiment with theatrical releases, and still are, by the way. I mean, Apple right now has, over the past 12 months and going forward, has used 3 different theatrical distribution teams to put Apple movies into theaters first before they go to Apple TV. And they're watching the numbers, and they're collecting their own data on how this works. Amazon has also been more than flirting with theatrical release on titles. They need to do it a bit more. But they both looked at this data and said theatrical releases are good for ancillary releases too. Netflix is the only one that has never really, other than putting a couple toes in the water with Knives Out and a couple other movies where they weren't really theatrical releases, they were close. Netflix just really doesn't want to put their business model into full-fledged theatrical releases. Why? Because of your point of scale versus selectivity, or I would put it as quantity versus quality. What Netflix wants is quantity. They want so much stuff on their service that you just have to subscribe to Netflix because it's the only way you can get access to that much stuff. That's a numbers game. That's not a quality game. If you go and ask people who are movie fans to name their 5 favorite Netflix original movies, they typically can't get to 5, right? But TV shows, whole different ballgame. But they can't get to 5 Netflix original movies because they're just not that good, and they're buried on a scrolling menu of 1,000 choices, and they don't have the optimization of a theater release to begin with. Whereas your point, Wade, 52 weeks in a theater cycle in 1 year, a couple big films can open any particular weekend, a couple small films, that's it. And film lovers will tell you if it's quality or not, right? They will keep coming. They will tell their friends. The word of mouth will pass, and the movie will establish its brand in theaters. So I've gone on very long with the answer. Ted Sarandos is a great answer. Of mine. We've had this debate for 30 years, Ted and I. We still disagree. Okay.
Well, and Scott Stuber, I think, was of your mind as well, and that was part of the reason that he left Netflix as well. He wanted to see more movies going direct to theaters for a longer period of time.
Yeah, and you talked about leaving money on the table, and you're right. And I think that everyone in those studios, even Netflix, will admit that they are leaving money on the table. But for them, that's not the point, right? it goes
Yeah.
back to Patrick's earlier point about Wall Street. And if a movie, because we talk so much about box office, if a movie doesn't do what it needs to do weekend one, those executives that were responsible for saying, let's put it in theaters and let's spend money on putting it in theaters rather than just putting it on our streaming platform, they look bad to their bosses. They look like they made a mistake. It doesn't matter if down the road that movie ends up doing really well on streaming. We are still not, as an industry, really focusing on that full narrative. We focus so much on theatrical releases, but there's not a lot of pressure to say, well, here's how this movie performed on the streaming platform. We don't have great metrics. We have some now, but we don't have great metrics on how a movie did on streaming. We certainly don't know how many times it was streamed in full with actually people watching it versus how often it was streamed on background. There's just not any way to really qualify or quantify how a movie does on streaming. So there's low risk. So yes, you're not going to reap the same rewards, but if your job is not dependent upon those rewards, if that is not the calculation for how you're defined as a successful executive, then why would any executive take that risk if they don't have to? If they're going to make their big salaries without taking any risk, what a job.
And one of the things that's happened with that
now
low
let
risk.
me bring this to the yes, Patrick.
I was just going to say, if it's one of the things that's happened with that low risk mentality is it's infected filmmakers. There are filmmakers who are like, oh, I'm okay with going to streaming because what if it fails? It's like, well, that's why you're in the business. You are in there to connect with audiences. You are in there to take risks as an artist, and you're going to be rewarded as an artist and as a business person by taking those big swings, by doing things that audiences have never seen before and really affecting them in a big way. But if you disappear, well, I got paid, I got my movie made, and nobody said you're a terrible filmmaker.
That's a perfect segue then to where I wanted to go with the awards conversation, because what we've also seen during this same period is the Academy Awards struggling. I mean, struggling mightily over the last 10 years. They've now been, I think, 4 straight years under 20 million viewers, and they used to get regularly 40 million viewers. So they've lost more than half of their audience during the last decade. And when I was analyzing this earlier in the year, I built a metric of my own. I call it the NIT, N-I-T-T, for nominees in top 10. And when you go back into the 50s and especially in the 60s and right up to 1970, what you see is a high correlation between movies that do well and get Academy Award nominations. And if movies do well and get Academy Award nominations, the Oscars do better and the movies do better. And we lost that somewhere kind of progressively weaving into the 90s, right? When all the indies divisions were created and they said, okay, these will be for our prestige films. And then we're going to put our let the main brands, the main studio brands handle the blockbusters. And over the last 10, 15 years, as the Academy Awards have struggled, we've lost the middle, as you were saying, John. We've lost those mid-level films that used to be the Rain Mans and the Driving Miss Daisies, the movies that a lot of us remember, the Schindler's Lists, those movies that studios released under a studio brand that made big money at the box office and then won lots of awards and brought a big audience to the television telecast of the Academy Awards. So again, that gets back to the conversation. How do we convince the studios to go back to what their own histories demonstrate once worked? Or do we? Have we passed that? Do we have to really rely entirely on new companies and new blood?
Well, I'll go first, but briefly, because I know Jackie and Patrick have some thoughts on this one too. And I'd say the record of the Oscars over the last couple of years is mixed in the point of tying movies that people like to see and pay to go see and movies that get acclaim from their own industry in the form of Academy Awards. And the film that did this the best for me is Oppenheimer, right? Widely respected by Hollywood, highly award-winning in many different ways and many different award shows, including the Oscars, and made a ton of money, right? So to me, Oppenheimer and Chris Nolan and Emma Thomas are kind of the saviors of this connection between film is a commercial venture and film is an artistic venture, and you can win both at the box office and at the Oscars. But wait, I will readily concede that that's the exception to the rule in recent years. And I wish there were more Oppenheimers, right? I wish there were more films that can break out in both ways, commercially and artistically. And I don't. I mean, we all go to or watch the Oscars religiously and love it. But I think I think my 21-year-old daughter and her friends don't love it anymore or don't ever watch it. It's too long. It's way too long. It's too politicized at times. The show doesn't have enough entertainment value. People really should stop thanking their publicist and their lawyers. And there's just a lot that's wrong with it as a modern entertainment experience, right? For you want to get kids on the East Coast of the United States to become film goers and film lovers, and your show doesn't end until way past bedtime on a Sunday night. I mean, there's, and I'm not original in these criticisms. Lots of people say what's wrong with the Oscars, and they just can't, they cannot reform it because it's Hollywood's precious night where everything has to be celebrated at great length with boring acceptance speeches. Sorry,
Right.
I
So
went
who
off.
are the Oscars for is the real question, right? They put them on television. They spend a lot of money marketing them as though the Oscars are for everyone. But that's not the case, right? Because if the Oscars were for everyone, then you would want to make sure that the movies that were being celebrated were movies that were for everyone. And the fact that movies only have to screen in a handful of locations for a handful of days means they're not really for everyone. It's okay to just put your movie in New York or Los Angeles or, a handful of other places, give them a week with, however little marketing, and then be eligible for an Academy Award. It should be the responsibility of the people behind the films to spend a quarter of what they spend on marketing for an Oscar to actually market for audiences, right? If you want that movie to matter, then does it matter? You want it to matter to your peers in Hollywood, or do you want it to matter to audiences? And so where you're spending your money tells me what you really believe. And so
Yeah.
it's fine if Hollywood wants to make, certain movies just for themselves and then celebrate it. Don't do hand wringing then that people around the world don't care. If, on the other hand, this is supposed to be a celebration of an art form that impacts people around the world, well, then you better do your darndest to make sure that the movies that are represented on that stage that night were movies that had an impact. The impact needs to be first, and then it's reflected by the awards. But if those movies exist in a vacuum and we're supposed to applaud for them, and then we're somehow Philistines for not caring about those movies, that's unfair. And people are tired of it, and that's why their TVs are turned off.
And
In other
I
words, the
think
best awards campaign is success.
yeah, I think, but talking about awards campaigns, I think this is also something that has distorted the industry, particularly the independent film industry, where there's the awards season and there's the movies that are being released into that season, and it becomes almost a ghetto of prestige movies. It's got prestige, it's an awards contender, therefore you should go see it. And they're not making the case for the movies themselves, not making the case for the story, not making the case to the audience. Why should you see this movie other than the fact that it's prestige? It's going to have a limited release in New York and Los Angeles to qualify for awards, and then we'll move into the next phase, and driving all of the interest based on awards. And I'm not necessarily going to go see a movie because it won an award or because it was nominated for an award. Is there a story? Is it attracting me? And we go back and we'll just mention some of the films we've mentioned before, which is Oppenheimer. It's released in July, not in the awards category or corridor of the end of the year. Everything Everywhere All at Once is released, I think, in May or April and played for a long time and surprised people, I think, by its huge, effectiveness at the Academy Awards. Go back to Parasite, a movie that was, again, not in that awards corridor. It was not sold as that. It was sold as an entertaining, riveting, scary, funny movie, right? You've got to sell the story. You've got to give the audience a reason for going, not just because it's going to be nominated.
Yeah, and let me just tie that together a little bit too, because for an audience, the reason an award show is exciting is because you're rooting for something, right? And so if the entire kind of calculation is let's get this movie an Oscar so it can get the post-Oscar bump, that means people weren't rooting for that movie. You're expecting your audiences didn't even see the movie yet. They haven't even seen it to care. And, again, anecdotal, because that's, for me, the best way to connect to it is the year that that Titanic, was nominated for a bunch of Oscars. That was the most important movie to me that year. Watched it, half a dozen times in the theaters. And when it was Oscar night, I spent all night just screaming and crying every time my movie won. I cared. And when I have my 10-year-old daughter watch the Oscars with me, what is she screaming for? Is she screaming for a movie she's never heard of? Absolutely not. Is she screaming for Turning Red? Yes. Barbie. She was screaming at the top of her lungs every time Barbie was mentioned. And that is an exciting opportunity. That is what you tune in for, is to feel like your team is going to win. You don't watch the World Series being like, I've never heard of this team, but if they're good at this World Series, then maybe I'll start watching baseball. What? That's not how it works. We're doing it backwards and then complaining about the results.
I'm always pointing out to people that only twice have the Academy Awards ever garnered more than 50 million people for an audience. Titanic and E.T. There it is.
Yeah, and the other element, thoughts? I think. Well,
John, Patrick, Jackie.
We have many final thoughts.
Go ahead,
Patrick.
I don't. It's. I think that there is, partly because of habit and structure and the way people think about movies and movie theaters, is that we've just disconnected from what audiences want. We have not really thought. That's not the first thing. There's a lot of talk, with streaming and everything else. We're going to go where the audience is, while at the same time leading them to these places where we own the audience in our streaming service and everything is on there is our movies. When we're not thinking about the actual movies themselves that people want to see and how to connect to them, to take the data that we have, to take the experiences that we have, that see where audiences are going and truly meet them there by fulfilling those needs, and for fulfilling needs that they don't even know they have yet. And that requires a less business-minded sense, right? It's more about that this is something that's very special, that fits a particular need, and that we can fulfill it. And that's the core of our business, not necessarily financial arrangements or ancillary markets or anything else. Be focused on the core of what your business is.
John, final word.
I would conclude by saying, don't be afraid of technology. And this industry is so old-fashioned in so many ways that there's a radical need to embrace technology. By that, I mean the use of data. By that, I mean the use of AI. By that, I mean the use of cost-cutting measures that make the process more streamlined, more targeted, and more efficient. And, that's what we hope to do, is to see if there are ways to streamline by using technology and enhance the production, distribution, and exhibition of movies so that more movies are available to more consumers who want to see them in movie theaters more often. So I think that's where we're headed, and we're very optimistic about the future of the biz.
As I am as well, and I'd like to thank all of you. My guests today, John Fithian, Jackie Brenneman, and Patrick Corcoran of the Fithian Group. You can visit the website at www.the-Fithian-group.com. This has been an outstanding conversation, and I thank you all for doing this and for contributing to this really important conversation, which I think just has to continue going forward. Anyone viewing this podcast who has not yet subscribed to The Hollywood Heretic, please go to hollywoodheretic.substack.com and consider becoming a paid subscriber for access to members-only content and podcast episodes. Until that time, please go out and make movies matter.